For this morning's moment of learning, we're going to cover something. Well, we always cover something. I thought we'd cover something that was related a little bit to what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be interesting because I'm going to have to explain a little bit of the fine line that I'm walking on. And I'll explain it as we get into the 2nd and 3rd John portions. But the question I wanted to address today was, how did welcoming guests differ in the ancient Near East? Because you see some ways that people are welcomed, and hospitality. I almost use the word hospitality. I want to be careful with that because we tend to also think of hospitality as just like the serving of food, or the different people have different ideas. So how does the welcoming of guests differ in the ancient Near East? And this is important because it actually plays into both this week and the next week as we continue to go through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And this week we're going to do 2nd John, but we're going to talk about this. Guests in the ancient Near East, hospitality has always had a strong cultural aspect to it. It's important to know this, both in a modern context and ancient. In fact, one of the big things in missions is when people go to other cultural contexts, they need to understand, first thing, that there are some things that are more permissible to be able to do in other cultures, and there are some things that are less permissible. And I don't need to go into a whole host of examples, but some of the things like crossing your leg and pointing your foot at somebody in some cultures is a really bad thing because you're showing your bottom of your foot to them. And so that's a cultural problem. There's a lot of, or not cultural problem, from their point of view, it's a difficulty. There's other things that you go to a lot of Muslim countries, and they're much more likely to invite you into their homes to talk about things, sometimes to talk about God. So what we take in our own perspective, sometimes we need to be careful, all the time, we need to be careful that we don't impute that. We don't take that and assume that A, that we're right about something, and then B, that everything else is read through that same lens. So it's always had a strong cultural aspect to it. In the ancient Near East, though, people were more they more readily invited guests into their homes. And we find this throughout the Bible, all the way from the beginning of Genesis, all the way to the end. And one of the things that guests from many of these, and I'm taking this as a big swath, certainly there's different cultures, and they look at things different ways, but for the most part, in the ancient Near East, guests were looked at as if they were sent to them by God. So there was even like almost a sacred duty to provide hospitality, even protection. You see that in Genesis, where they're protecting the men, the angels that are there, they're protecting them. And the 3 types of guests that they had, and this is important, 3 types of guests they had were friends, strangers, and enemies. You're like, well, wait a second, enemies were guests? Yes. They had many cases where their enemies were their guests. In fact, I don't need to go through a lot of it, but there were sayings such as that if an enemy has dismounted their horse and touched the corner of your tent, then you are safe. And there was a sense that you were supposed. Now, that doesn't mean they necessarily liked them, but from a hospitality point of view, they were almost obligated to do that, and they felt that that was something that they were supposed to do. Hospitality was a basic and integral part of their culture. To reject someone or to be inhospitable was countercultural for them. That went against their grain of what they naturally wanted to do, what the expectations of what a person should do. So to reject somebody or to be inhospitable was countercultural. Even if the person was your enemy, as I said, so long as they respected the guidelines of being a guest, such as not being hostile towards your family or to their host, they were generally invited to stay. Interpersonal relationships took a back seat to the duty to make a guest feel welcome and even safe. And by the way, as we'll see in the next few weeks, this can be good and this can be bad. It's their cultural aspect, and that's something that John's going to talk about. So that's all I wanted to bring up for that and how cultural aspects has to do with welcoming and hospitality. So